So, David, Kerin, thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the Track and Field Performance Podcast. For those who may not be familiar with who you are and what you do, please give us an introduction.
Well, I'm a 65-year-old former collegiate coach. Um, I've worn a lot of hats in sport, but my background is primarily track and field. Um, I coached at the collegiate level here in the U.S. I also was one of the national team administrators for USA Track and Field. I coached an international team or two. My area of, I guess, focus or specialty was jumps and particularly the high jump, but that broadened out to include all event areas at one point where in the States, I was asked to become the lead administrator on the men's side of the sport in the US for what we call development, national team development, where we're trying to get athletes to the next level. So the way I explain it is people would approach me and they knew I had been involved for many years with USA Track and Field, and they'd say, "Are you going to the Olympics this year?" And I'd say, "Well, that's actually not my job. My job is to try to get more people on the plane." So that kind of focuses in general. Um, Aside from that, my personal background and my motivation or my curiosity has always been to learn more. And from a scientific viewpoint, that had me gravitating to a mutual friend of ours, Dan Path, along with other people, like-minded individuals in sport, initially in this country and then expanding out internationally. About 25 years ago or so, I was working on a research project on eccentric strength that today, if you looked at it, would look sophomoric or childish compared to what the science currently says. But back then, that period of time ago, no one in the world had come out and made a declarative statement of the primacy of eccentric strength over concentric or isometric. So I kind of took an approach where I threw a bunch of ideas against the wall, and the one that stuck when it was all over was eccentric, where when you try to explain why concentric could be the primary focus, it was easier to prove why it wasn't than it was. And through that kind of, I have a friend in the sports world who describes me as a hillbilly engineer, where I'm not the traditional peer-reviewed biomechanist or scientist. I approach things from my own unique perspective, and I find I end up getting where I want to get to or where the evidence leads to, but in a less traditional sense than most. But anyway, that was my springboard. That got me going. That got picked up by a coach here in the States, renowned coach, gentleman by the name of Vern Gambetta. And Vern got me tracked into that whole cohort of the Dan Paffs and the Gary Winklers and the Bush Naders and people of that nature. And I found a home. I found my tribe, so to speak, that I've always lived in a small state area of the country, and so you don't run into people on a regular basis that think and speak in those, very defined areas. And so now I had a connection. So from that point, I just have continued on. I'm currently uh, retired from coaching and semi-retired in life, other than I am doing some consulting. I'm working now actually with sports outside of track and field, which has been a nice kind of recharge to my batteries as far as it's a unique group to work with and a unique set of challenges. And I actually just recently received or filed my provisional patent for a system. I don't want to get too far into it because I am filing for full patent protection, but it's a next level form of analysis of movement where the market currently has an awful lot of what is the term is called mocap, which is non-markered analysis of movement. It's that stick figure drawing where the angles reflect where joints come together on the body, and tracking or tracing that path through in a 2D world, and now adding extra cameras, they're starting to move toward three-dimensional analysis. Well, my effort is something that actually sits above that level, and it's kind of interesting. And if nothing else, it's intellectually stimulating and challenging. So I'm kind of enjoying that work. Um, Other than that, I'm just happy to be around and happy to talk to people, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
Yeah, well, we're definitely going to have a nice deep dive into a lot of those areas that you mentioned there today. Um, Something I want to start off with, and this is definitely something I noticed from listening to your content through different podcasts, but also the articles that you've wrote as well, including the eccentric strength training, and just so your posts on LinkedIn, you're definitely someone who I would say is interested and very knowledgeable on data and also biomechanics. And you just mentioned it with obviously the route you're going down with being kind of almost like an innovator in that area. You've had influences from Boo and Dan and various other coaches like that, but what got you maybe more curious about that side of the sport? Because yes, you have very good track and field knowledge, and I've read some articles where you're talking about high jump specific things, but that seems like a unique specialization in its own right. And I'm curious before we move on to the more specific stuff, what got you fixated on those details more than others?
Um, I think it was kind of a, I don't want to say a logical progression, but uh, the things about, for instance, I really enjoy track and field because of the nature of it's not a case of if I substitute a player or switch from an offensive approach to a defensive approach to get success in the sport. It's about mastering human movement. It's about maximizing potential that 100%, if it leaves you a half a second slower than your competition, how do you find a way to close that gap? I like track and field particularly because you don't get cheated. There's not like the old joke when the gymnasts in the Olympics, the Eastern European official giving you a bad score because you were from a Western nation, that sort of thing. You don't get bad calls in track and field that often. So it's a very honest sport. At the same time, athletes can't hide. They either put themselves out there and do the performance. They don't. The clock and the tape don't lie. So those concepts appeal to me very much. So I can't remember who told me years and years ago, but they would talk about Saturday being the most boring day of the week for a coach because either you bake the bread, either the product is there, and you should rightfully expect results from the work that's been put in, or not. But again, it's a different perspective than say a soccer, basketball, football, baseball, hockey, those sorts of team sport activities. If you have an off day, you're in trouble. And in our sport, in track and field, if you have an off day, that one time every 4 years, you've just banked 4 years and then not gotten the payout on the other end. So all those and more tend to appeal to me for a lot of different reasons, I guess.
Another piece that you wrote a couple of years ago that was sent to me by a coach, I believe it was Dan, was on fixing the right problem. And I think that was a really interesting piece to read because recently, I suppose I've engaged in a lot of conversations with coaches talking about technical breakdowns and what they're seeing and how they, suppose, refer back to the origin of the problem. And I don't know if it's just the coaching circles that I'm in or the people I'm surrounded by, but I felt like your piece was a very, very good way of, I suppose, rethinking how we actually coach, especially in technical events like the high jump. So I suppose not everyone has read that. So I'd love you to maybe go through your coaching philosophy as it pertains to that piece or any evolutions that have come about since that time.
Well, there's a lot of different ways we can go with that. The basic genesis of that concept is that when you identify a flaw, an error, an undesirable component of performance, that's not the start point. That's not the cause. There's a cause and effect angle that you have to consider. I tell people when I lecture that my 87-year-old mother doesn't know a lot about sport, certainly doesn't know anything about biomechanics. She's never used the word penultimate in a conversation, those sorts of things. But when she's watching on TV and she sees something, she can point at the screen and go, that doesn't look good, or that's not right, or oops, or that sort of. So she can perceive of flaws. But if you hone in on that moment in time, that's not the fix because there's something that occurred earlier in the sequence that led to that moment, led to that breakdown, to the point where a coach like the people we've named, and I'd like to think on some level I have a similar quality, a coach can watch an error and without having even seen, say, two strides earlier, they can pretty accurately predict what had taken place at that moment that led to the breakdown. Things get worse exponentially from a certain point. So you can trace it back. I mean, if you really want to go down a rabbit hole, you could trace it back to if the person got a bad night's sleep the night before the performance, that sort of concept. So by deconstructing and working your way back, you want to get to the earliest point where you then have optimal execution and work forward. If the first step is optimal, let's look at number two, and we work our way forward. In the case of high jump, a typical approach will be 5 straight steps and 5 curved steps. Well, if something's wrong at the plant, that really was predetermined much earlier in that run up. So it usually often can be a case of, well, let's work our way backward. If the plant is off, I can trace you back to where the curve was initiated. And if the curve wasn't initiated effectively, the rest of the curve just suffered and to the point where the plant couldn't be executed. But at curve initiation, if the person isn't in a position to initiate the curve effectively, now we've got to go back an earlier step. And we work our way backward to where the problem starts and then, bloomed into what we saw as the poor execution or the failed attempt or the less than optimal performance.
And did that come to you through, I suppose, mentors, or did that come through your own observations? I suppose I'm thinking like perhaps some many years ago that this maybe wasn't commonplace to actually think this way. I'm interested to know where that kind
Oh,
of
sure.
philosophy
I,
stemmed from.
it really, for me, it's funny because it brings up Dan again. I don't want to over promote our buddy, but I was filming, I was working with the high jumpers back again 20 some odd years ago. Um, and I was working, it was 2005, and our best male high jumper, Matt Hemingway, had just won silver in Athens in 2004. And so I was talking with him and we're exchanging information. And then I had to leave because the women's high jump was taking place. And I was on the infield, actually on the apron, filming for our later use. And I was filming from, as you face the pit, I was filming from the right side, which meant I was capturing the opposite side jumpers. So the female jumpers that took off on their right foot. Well, as we know, the population tends to be handed, and the number of women or men who jump off their right foot in high jump is less than the opposite. So that day, all the females in the US competing for the US championship who were right foot takeoff had gone out of the competition. There were still women remaining who were left foot jumpers. So I was directly behind those individuals. And I said, just for the heck of it, I'm going to change my perspective. I'm going to film these women from behind and see what I see what I can pick up. And I noticed something in one particular jumper that was really, frankly, alarming. And what I was noticing is the way I described high jump is 5 straight steps and 5 curved steps. What I was finding was there wasn't a commitment to initiate the curve. There wasn't a transition, a positive, assertive transition from straight line running mechanics to enter the curve. And so what was happening, and what I've come to see almost universally at this point, is athletes don't commit 5 steps out to initiating a curve, but what they tend to do is they do a couple of different things in concert. One is they tend to drift in the direction of the curve without actually generating curvature. The other thing they'll do, and this has been a sore spot for many years, is you don't lean to create lean. Lean is a byproduct of the correct application force. So the two are critical to initiate a curve. As you're running straight line mechanics, heel toe, foot strikes, how do you change out of that pattern to then create curvature? Curvature creating lean, greater speed, tighter curvature creating more lean as a reaction. And so that wasn't happening. But what was happening is, like I described it as, is these athletes would tend to drift inward for 2 steps. So if the sequence is 5 steps and it's a left-footed jumper, if you work your way back, if the plant step is a left foot before you jump, the penultimate is the right. The next to last step again is another right, which is 3 steps back. 1, 2, 3, left, right, left, working plant, penultimate, next to last. What was happening is the 2 steps prior to that moment, there was drift without redirection to the center of mass. So they were getting deep to the pit, but they were far away from where they needed to be at plant. because they hadn't run a curve. They haven't initiated the curve. So what was happening is 3 steps out, they had to create a huge pivot on that inside left leg to reorient themselves in the direction of where the plant was. And then they were running a straight line from that step after pivot to the penultimate to the plant of the high jump. So there was no curvature ever. There wasn't curvature in the 2 previous steps, which would have facilitated the curve. 3 steps out, it was a natural reaction that they have to pivot. And then the last 2 steps are straight. So again, that hillbilly engineer in me coined the phrase that high jump has become long jump with a Cirque du Soleil finish, where in essence, the last 3 steps are running a straight line to the plant. The athlete jumps straight up, and the flight path follows that orientation. In essence, a long jump while the athlete tries to contort their body around the bar. So anyway, we can get as wonky and deep in that as you want, and there will be other references, I'm sure, down the road here. But I identified that moment in time, and years later, Dan Paff and I are talking, and he had identified an English high jumper with a similar flaw. So it's almost become like a friendly competition. Andreas Brem will tell you too that people that are engaged with Dan are always looking to find something he hasn't seen yet or something he doesn't know. We're always looking for that one time where you can teach the teacher that moment, and you walk away with such a great feeling of success. Well, I came to Dan, I described what I was describing, and he immediately says, yeah, back in 2001, and he names the guy and describes it. I'm like, oh, I thought I had it. I thought I had that golden moment, and I didn't. But anyway, so that wherever you want to go with this, a concept, like I said, you don't lean to create lean, or if you fall inward to create the sense of lean, it's unsupported. There's not force into and back from the ground that makes that a stable position. But to get away from high jump, because I don't want to be totally zoned in on that one particular event, the concept of path of center of mass. Okay. So when you run a curve, similar to lean and that concept, when you run a curve, you're not running a radial path normally. Okay. A radius is curved, but all curves are not radial. So if you take that and extend it forward, if you look at all the technical publications in high jump, they always show a semicircle, a radial line as the second half of the approach, but that's not what's taking place. That's not what's being run. Okay, so that's number one. Now, having worked with that, and I was very fortunate. It's kind of a good story that I don't want to waste a lot of time on, but I actually coached an athlete in collegiate here in the US who then went on, got his master's, then went on, got his PhD as a biomechanist, and he became my biomechanist for USA Track and Field. And we did some really unique research, and it pointed out some things that I had seen but not been able to associate with what was taking place. And so he actually kind of, a lot of people along the way, I've got to give a lot of credit, not just Dan or Boo or people like that, but this Dr. Jim Becker, who's now out at Montana State University as biomechanist, and so many other people who, it's almost as though I've led a charmed life where when I needed a resource, it's been there, or it's come along. I've made the connection. I've had that help, and so it's furthered my path and facilitated my efforts greatly. So I'm really appreciative to all these people and more. But anyway, to get back to the more of the physics and the geometry of a run, a curve could be radial, but not necessarily radial. All radiuses are curves. What takes place in sport very rarely is radial. You could say, for instance, on a track, 400-meter track, 200-meter track, that is a curved lane. It is a half circle. And so when you run along that, you are running a near radial line. But even that has variances if you get down in the granularity of what's taking place. But for the naked eye and the casual observer, they're running a radius or a semicircle. But in sport, change of direction, stop and go, avoiding, defenders or those sorts of things, you're changing direction. So it's non-linear. High jump, we already discussed. And so what I'm trying to get at is to change from a linear path, you need to apply force correctly. So if my desire is to go to my left, I need an opposing force to my right equal to redirect my center of mass to the amount I want it redirected. So my theory is redirection and reorientation, that you redirect the center of mass, then you reorient the mass to the new direction. If you're following me with that.
Hmm. Hmm.
So if you look at the torso, the shoulder joints, the shoulder axis, and the hip axis, I'd like to have those remain perpendicular to the path, and I'd like the long axis of the foot to basically be the compass point, the direction of the path. So where you'll see that is if you watch, for instance, if you watch American football, you'll watch athletes carrying the ball and they're trying to avoid defenders and stop and go and twist and turn. And some look very, I want to say ragged or less smooth, and some are really just motor geniuses on how to do that and then get back to the target, the north-south sort of orientation, because in American football, you want to go down the field. Side to side doesn't give you a lot of return. So the ability to keep the torso perpendicular to the direction, the ability to put the foot down, all those things I just described are skills that either somebody has or doesn't have. And again, that's areas of intervention potentially for a coach to participate in. So another example, I was at we had a meeting of our top sprint coaches, and a gentleman, a scientist who I won't name, was speaking to our coaches on the latest observations in sprinting and that sort of thing. And the focus that day, the focus of his lecture was the first 10 meters, the first 10 steps, how do you track those and identify better or lesser performances. And so he was describing the nature of the body's relationship in lean to the track surface and rising out of forward lean and with acceleration and with stride lengthening, how these things progress. But what he was describing were all two-dimensional benchmarks. So if you think about the XY axis, if you think about what's taking place from that sagittal view, and I asked the question, I said, okay, but how about where those footfalls are occurring away from the center of mass, outward in either direction? What about the orientation of the long axis of foot with each one of those? And don't those influence stride length and all the other things we're discussing here? And I think it caught him off guard. And to his credit, he handled it well and came back the next day and did a little deeper dive into that thing. But um, I just actually today it just hit the market. There's a publication for the coaches in the United States called the organization is U.S. Track and Field and College Coaches, USTFCCCA. I'm sure you've probably seen it. It's based out of Baton Rouge and that mafia down there.
Hmm.
And I sent in an article and they published it. And it was on uh, a number of things about coaching and perception, those sorts of things. But in it, I make the claim that we have a lot of two-dimensional thinker-seers who are trying to coach three-dimensional movement. And that's problematic in and of itself, but it's made worse when that individual won't let go of those 2D benchmarks or that limitation. Frankly, not wanting to get in trouble with the science community, but we have uh, scientists working with athletes who don't do three-dimensional modeling. They stay within that 2D realm, and that ignores key influencers on performance. So how do we get at that? And I mean, you could just go have a cup of coffee. I can go forever on this, but part of the importance here is identifying that some people are capable to process the information they see. Again, there's a reason why the Dans and others of the world are acknowledged universally as the top of the game, the best in sport. There are reasons why coaches consult with people like that. And one of the reasons I would argue that they've risen to that level is not because they went out and recruited a talented individual who succeeded, and then the coach rode those coattails to acknowledgement of being a great coach, but rather the person that is able to, like I said, think and see in three-dimensional concepts. The ability to see motion from one vantage point, one perspective, and while not seeing the other side of the body, know what has to be taking place because you have the indicators that deny anything but what has to be taking place. Most people can't process that way. They don't think that way. They're not, and that's not good or bad. It just is. So acknowledging you don't have that skill set is the first step to becoming more effective as a coach. So where can you address that? Well, reliance on video would help. Focusing on a single benchmark or a single, anchor point in performance or of the body and tracing that through repetitive motion. And you start to you'll hone the skill to whatever degree you can. So I've coined the phrase 2.5 dimension or 2.5D, where if you're thinking and seeing in 2D, can you move to 2.5, maybe not all the way to 3, but you're still advancing your capacity to intake visual, movement and process it in a more effective way that you can then be of that much more value to the athletes you're working with. Unfortunately, here in the States, it's really the coaching game has changed over the years to where it's really who recruits the best talent. We
Mm.
don't have a lot of great development coaches like we did back in the day. And I understand that, for instance, in the field events, it's very rare that a U.S. coach in the field events is the head coach of a collegiate program. So they don't dictate what the program does, how the program uh, disseminates scholarship money, those sorts of things. They're all working on what aren't great wages to start, but one of the incentives is if you're the conference team winner, if you have people make nationals, if you have national champions, there are bonuses built in, and those are would seem like lofty aspirations, but are they always consistent with a development mindset or a development atmosphere where the athletes you're working with may need a timeline that doesn't fit within next week's competition or
Mm.
doesn't match up with being the best they possibly can be on June 12th or whatever the date may be. So it's a contradiction in terms to be developmental in nature and to reach the highest possible level of success in a program in the setup we have here in the States. So it's funny, I'm a lifetime, citizen of the United States, but I don't always have a positive view of how we do business here.
Mhm.
And I think that's a shortcoming of our program here, where we're not as developmental as we could be. I mean, opportunistic if it's a athlete from somewhere that doesn't have access to the facilities we have, the medical care we have, the financial support that programs will allow. Those are of value, but I think we've gotten away from or we've lost the recipe on how to best develop athletes. And we're fortunate because we have such a great physical talent pool, such gifted athletes in this country that it hasn't been an urgency, but if you follow the news right now with NIL and the NCAA and the focus on football and basketball over all of the sports, I think there's a reckoning that might be coming down the road.
Mm. Do you think that's why some athletes tend to struggle after the collegiate years because they maybe exhausted all of the physical development tools that they could have in those very, very short spaces of time?
Absolutely, and in a lot of different ways. For instance, your elite athletes, your top, eight in any year's world championship, don't compete every Saturday, but the NCAA schedule competes every Saturday. Not every Saturday in the outdoor season, every Saturday from January 1 to mid-June. Now,
Hmm.
obviously, you don't necessarily go that way you don't compete every weekend, but the urgency to compete is so much greater, and that's contrary to maximizing human performance for any number of reasons. Um, I'm trying to think of there was something else I wanted to touch on in that area, and it'll probably come to me later, but um, and that again, that's a tough balance. So
Mm.
at the same time, if you're a scholarship athlete, you do have a debt or a responsibility to, perform and put your best foot forward, so to speak. So again, is it the best environment for development? Maybe, maybe not. Increasingly, I find that there's some debate about that, and I'm not trying to alienate a number of friends at the NCAA level, but let's call it for what it is.
Mm. And you're in an interesting position a few years ago where, when you were chairing at USATF, you probably would have noticed that a lot of athletes didn't need 15 meets to reach a personal best. They maybe
Mhm.
met it in like 5 or 6. So it kind of shows, on average, with these stats, we can infer that this is, potentially overcompeting, really.
Well, you have a lot of differences too, even within the sport, if we're staying within track and field, where different athletes in different event areas and different genders may peak at different stages of their career. For instance, in the US, we have a list 50 deep of 100-meter sprinters. We're never at a loss for somebody to run the 100 meters. So, in reality, if a 100-meter runner at, say, age 18 or 19 isn't running 10, sub 10.2, it's not realistic to expect all of a sudden that person's going to suddenly find 9.8 out of the blue. So you can track that pattern or that athlete career differently than a highly technical event like, say, the hammer or a distance event. Or so people are on different developmental timelines, but the U.S. development path has always been through the NCAA, come out of the NCAA, work toward national team status. Um, we did do something. I wasn't directly, but I was indirectly connected to. We identified that as a problem in our development system. We created a financial safety net where we the acronym is TPP, Talent Protection Program. We found that athletes were graduating college, and if they weren't financially stable the first 2 years, they were dropping out of the sport. And we never realized their full potential. We never saw what they might have been able to do. And so the athletes that come out after 4 years of college and are, you know, top 10 in the world, they get the shoe contract, they get a lane in Europe, they have
Mm,
the advantages both for development and for financial stability that next group of athletes didn't. And so we
hmm.
tried to address that. So there are, well-intended, intelligent people looking at the situations we're describing and trying to address them. But at the same time, I have to be defensive of our sport and the fact that our budget most closely mirrors Great Britain's.
Mm,
For this nation of this size and this population and its distance from the Euro track scene, the annual budget of the national governing body is roughly equivalent to the same budget in England.
mm,
And now here's the kicker. They were getting their money from the national lottery. They didn't even have to raise it.
hmm, hmm.
So I'm not asking for a European listener to this, discussion to take pity on and pass the hat to collect for the US program, but it's not as easy or as smooth a process of high level of achievement as it may or could be. But again, we've been fortunate that the NCAA programs provide a no cost to low cost developmental system that we wouldn't have otherwise. We do have a lot of corporate, you know, business world opportunities for financial support of the sport. There are definitely advantages over here as well, but things evolve. I mean, the world got smaller with internet and the ability to immediately transfer video information and educational and all sorts of different medical and technology advancements to where a Kenyan jab thrower can pull up the internet on YouTube and learn how to throw the jab and become all a world beating individual just basically on their own organically. So the advantages I think that we had in the US at one point are slowly kind of dissipating or falling by the wayside. And so everybody, has to look at reinventing and how can we do things, better, more effectively.
I've always found it interesting that the US, club scene from a post-collegiate standpoint just isn't really a thing. Like I was a collegiate athlete a few years ago, and the idea that I would go back to Ireland and compete for my club and continue doing track and field as a 24-year-old was just bizarre to some people. But and all the while not being that good either. A very average collegiate athlete, just about making the NCAA prelims really. But, you know, it's funny because it seems like, to your point there, that if athletes don't get that support, if they're not at the elite level, which in any other country they would be because, an 8 meter long jumper would get their ticket to the World Championships handy in Ireland. Yeah, that in between really isn't there about like I'll work my 9 to 5 or a semi, full-time job and just keep going for a few years and see what I can do. It's an interesting cultural difference, really.
Well, you touched on a lot of different things there. For instance, we both know that being on your feet 8 hours a day at a job is counterproductive to be an elite athlete,
Of
but
course.
you have to pay the bills, obviously. At the same point, the area that I was involved with in our NGB most directly was one where we were identifying the top individuals in each event area, and they were getting a certain financial stipend package, kit, whatever you want to describe it as, um, where I and my counterpart on the female side came in was the athletes after those individuals, but were near national level talent, and we were trying to get them to that next stage. And we had a fixed budget, and we literally had thousands of people that all thought themselves worthy of financial support, and we couldn't do that. So in a given year, we had roughly 70 or so athletes we could financially support. So that was problematic in that the 71st and the 80th and the 170th all thought they were, realistically thought they were on the path to Olympic success and wanted support. And we didn't have the finances to give it to them. And then on the flip side as well, is we would have athletes that we'd support for a year or two, and they wouldn't show the improvement gains or that they were heading in an upward direction, an improvement viewpoint, to where we had to stop funding them. But they're living the dream, they're chasing the dream. They didn't necessarily see it the same way. And it's some delicate conversations to tell somebody that you don't have to stop training or competing. We just can't support you. And in the US, there's always a backflow of college graduates. The next year's class, so to speak, is coming into the system. Whereas people on the other end are more likely to deny or not want to give up the dream, not wanting to transition to another phase of life. And so it was an interesting dynamic being in that zone, dealing with the individuals. And we were fortunate. I mean, and over the years, we had a number of athletes who were developmental athletes in our system who ended up medaling in the games. So we did the good job, but there was never enough money, and it's difficult. Like I said, the nature of chasing the dream, and you're so vested in it, and in your home community, people are saying, yes, yes, this person's going for the Olympics. Well, they're an Olympic hopeful, they're not an Olympian yet. But again, that distinction is hard to get across to people who don't know the intricacies of the sport. And then you as the individual don't want to let your community down, particularly if anybody's helping you financially. You don't want to feel you've let them down. So it's a really challenging dynamic to be in the middle of. And I'd like to think we did a good job, over my years, and the again, my counterparts on the female side. But there's always more need than there is potential for support.
Hmm. I want to take a little bit of a pivot back to high jumping, and I think it goes into a broader philosophy yet again in technical events. Something that you've said recently, well, that I read recently, I should say, is the idea of kind of blending whole and part practice together. And I always find that interesting because when I think about, long jump or horizontal jumps, which is what I coach, I can't imagine it's too different in this sense that we obviously build things out of specific contexts like acceleration work and whatnot, but inevitably we have to transition to a point where the best kind of KPI is where we know that these things have held up under the most specific conditions possible. And what you're talking about there, I think the curve and the entry into the curve and everything else is very important. I suppose probably a great example of how one might understand this on a deeper level. So I guess what I'm saying is, in your coaching expertise, how much of developing those abilities that you talked about happens both together and separately, if you get what I'm saying?
Well, it's dependent on a number there. You got to put it in a context of, am I working with I've worked with athletes who are already internationally competitive and have been medalists at that level to, in the States, we call it high school, teenagers working their way up. So it's somewhat unique to those individuals, but let's frame it in that context. The thing I drill down on a lot is discussing a penultimate step. And about, again, many years ago, I think it was 2008, I was doing a lecture during our Olympic trials, and I described that Europeans at the time were de-emphasizing or not discussing the term penultimate. And I went on to explain why by drawing this parallel or using this example that if you go to a youth school, a grade school, young children, 5-year-olds, 6-year-old, 8-year-olds, and it's rained and there's a puddle, half those kids want to stomp in the puddle and have a good time. But there's always that one daredevil, that one that wants to see if they can jump over the puddle without getting wet. Well, I guarantee you that that individual will take a running start and they'll run up to the puddle. They will execute a penultimate step and they will jump. Whether they make it or not is immaterial to the point I'm trying to make. Nobody ever told that little kid about a penultimate step, yet they innately know how to execute it because they have to redirect the path of center of mass. They have to transition horizontal velocity to vertical velocity. Well, in the States, we'll take that kid, we'll put him in a high school, and the high school coach went to a clinic, and John Doe or Bob Smith was the lecturer at this clinic, and he talked about the penultimate, and he drilled down for 45 minutes on the penultimate and execution, and so that coach goes back and takes this kid who already innately knows how to execute a penultimate and just hammers in him all about the value and the importance of penultimate step. And what we did is we just made that guy averse to running fully up to that moment, executing what they already can, and making the jump. So sometimes analysis paralysis, or sometimes a focus on one particular component is not productive to overall success. So some of it is meeting the individuals where they are, or identifying what they already can apply correctly. Another perspective would be, like I said, if you look and you identify a breakdown in technique or a flaw in the performance, you immediately have to look back from that moment to where something was improperly executed that led to that result. It's never identifying the moment. So that's that fix the right problem theory from that paper years ago. So the next thing might be, for instance, if you identify a problem, but what time of year or season is it for that athlete? And is the solution worse than the problem? So it's kind of like the physician's oath, where you're supposed to do no harm as a doctor. Well, if the surgery is going to do more harm than the disease or the injury, sometimes you need to leave it alone. So again, what context, what individual, give me the specific example, and we can hone in on whole, part whole, as it applies in that situation. But again, and this all kind of interrelates, I tend to aggregate things together and try to put them under an umbrella term. And so this is not dissimilar to, like I said, 2D thinking and seeing versus three-dimensional realities, or three-dimensional execution issues, those sorts of things. They all tend to relate. One of the things I used to get frustrated on the national level was, it's no secret we tend to drop the baton when the pressure's on. And so that being the case, more than once in a high performance executive committee meeting, I raised my hand. I said, are we checking to see if any of these athletes wear contacts? And on the day of the race, are we confirming their contacts are actually in their eyes? So you fix the fixables, you address the most obvious things, the easiest things, and by process of elimination, you work your way towards solution as well. So if the outgoing runner can't assess where that incoming runner is, and they take off from that identification of a start mark because that morning they didn't put their contacts in, but they didn't want to tell anybody because they didn't want to get pulled out of their leg in the finals of the 4x1, we've got a problem that nobody's identified. So we can drill and drill and drill handoffs all we want, but we didn't fix the right problem. So those sorts of things. And it's that perspective, looking at things that are not necessarily obvious, but maybe either contributing factors or may be the point of contention, the issue that we really need to address. So again, context plays a lot. So I'm not trying to be evasive and avoid answering the question, but it's really about context when you drill down to that granular level. When you get down to, like you said, whole part, when you get down to the part, why are you going to that moment in time?
Hmm.
And what do you expect to gain from it? And you don't fix a part to make the part better. You only fix a part to make the whole better.
Hmm.
If it's not
Hmm.
going to improve the entire performance, it's fool's gold. It's the wrong place to be looking.
Mm. Yeah, you bring up many different variables there that are certainly worth considering, and I totally agree. Negotiating change with an athlete and when is the right time to address something is super important. And we will actually go there later. But yeah, to give you, I suppose, a more specific example, we've got a new athlete. He's came in with you. He has no timeline in terms of like when this needs to get right. But what you do know from watching video and previous footage of his, that his general running mechanics around a curve in are not great. He's got good bounding skills. He can bound out of the back in a linear fashion quite
Mhm.
well. There's no obvious one step that is necessarily off the path, but you can see in general their curve mechanics are not great. So there
Sure.
might be a need there to actually address
Um,
those in whole, but then also as part of the full run as well. That's what I'll say. There's a
well,
need for both.
I'll give you an example. And I don't want to stray, so it all comes back together. But the nature of running a curve, a collegiate coach reached out to me a couple years ago because their college conference championship meet was being held on a flat track indoors. So 200 meter indoor track. Their athletes were running on a banked track all season, and then for some reason, the facility that was allowed to host their conference championship was a flat surface. And he was worried about his athletes, in the 400 being able to manage speed and how to effectively run a curve. So that to me is a correlation or direct relation to running a high jump curve for a lot of reasons. But to try and tie it together, there's a mistaken belief in this country here, and I think we're the virus that is actually spread out internationally, where the concept of the tighter the start point of a high jump approach as viewed on the long axis of the high jump bar. So if you take the crossbar, it creates a line and you come out 90 degrees from that, the tighter the start point. So if you measure out from the standard, say, 10 feet or 3.5 meters or whatever the measurement is, that tighter relationship to the plant point is a positive or something to aspire to or something to train to where we've had coaches who insist on that being what their athletes execute. Well, that's problematic in a whole part whole situation like we're describing, because if they're not running effectively in a curve, putting them in that tight relationship doesn't allow them to adapt to better mechanics that they can then bring to the event itself. So now to bring it back out to the track coach who was looking for preparation for the flat surface, that sort of thing. The first thing I said is do all your running in lane 6. Train them in lane 6. Run them as fast as you want in lane 6. Stay away from lane 1, 2, 3. There's a reason why indoors they don't use lane 1, 2, or 3 for the elite 400-meter runners, because it's been proven that it's a disadvantage. Well, if you're working on the mechanics of running or baton exchange or whatever the case you're focusing on, work from the wider radius until you see performance that is what you're looking for, and then and only then can you then come in a lane, or a high jumper then can come in a little tighter, and you work your way forward. Another flaw we have here that I see a lot is at the first sign of adaptation, coaches move on to more advanced concepts or more challenging issues when the concept has been demonstrated, but it's not stabilized, it's not repeatable. Or they can do it in a practice setting, but in the pressure of competition, they revert back to the bad habits. So it's not enough for them to demonstrate that they've acclimated to what you're trying to get across. It has to become the new motor program, the new normal for them. And then you add the challenge, then you restrict, then you make things more challenging, more difficult, and they adapt. And it's a slow progressional work to where you eventually get to where you're trying to get to, as far as, again, the nature of running a curve, the nature of whatever execution you're looking for, be it in a throwing circle or whatever the case may be. So that sort of view to that. So now I'm going to turn it around, and the nature of the high jump approach, unfortunately, people can't run a curve because of the start point being such as it is. That I said, for instance, as you come out from the standard and you measure back to your start point, that 90-degree relationship to the plant, to where you want to plant. If you think about drawing a rectangle and drawing a square, the rectangle on its vertical axis, the long axis of the rectangular box, drawing a curve from the bottom corner of that rectangle to the upper corner of that rectangle, and a curved line or a semi-radial line. And then if you continue that circle all the way through, versus doing the same thing in a square box where you draw from one corner to the opposite upper corner, the broader the baseline, the further out, in the case for the high jumper, from the standard, they're able to run a curve more effectively. So the mistake, again, the 2D versus 3D thinking and seeing, is that a tighter start point along the axis of the bar will enable a tighter curve when it's the opposite. And so the coach in that scenario is not putting the athlete in the position to achieve what they're looking for. So, you're both in the blind, struggling, looking. Well, the athletes find a way to accommodate because they can't execute a curve in that relationship to the plane of the bar. So what they do is they make the adjustment. And that's where that drift for two steps, pivot, and straight line solution came from, because they couldn't achieve what the coach was looking for. But again, because we've gotten so far, Dick Fosbury, the late Dick Fosbury, I was very fortunate to strike up a friendship with him. He was such an incredibly intelligent individual that first off, that he came up to the solution he came up to. But if you watch his videotape from 1968, the execution is effortless. His run is relaxed. He hits the plant and he just rotates through positions and floats into the pit. And he's not straining or steering or adapting or adjusting, or there's none of that sort of, noise in the performance. It's really a thing of beauty, frankly. And it's borne out by the fact that in 1968, his coach at Oregon State, Bernie Wagner, was being interviewed, and Bernie told the reporter that Dick wasn't even one of the best athletes on his college team, yet he was an Olympic gold medalist in the high jump. Performance closed the gap and overcame maybe potentially lesser physical gifts or genetic predisposition. So, and then the other thing I tell when I talk to people is Dick jumped 224 in 1968. How far has technique and instruction in the high jump come when Dick was, by his college coach's own statement, an average athlete, was able to jump 2 meters 24? Every college in this country today would love to have a 224 jumper. It's beyond 50 years, and we're still fighting the same fights. If anything, it's gotten worse here. Where I talked about USA Track and Field Development, and I initially was in charge of the high jump, then I was in charge of both men's and women's high jump in the country, and then I became overseer of all events under the development umbrella. So the people that were in charge of the throws, the hurdles, the distance would report to me, and I was overseeing those programs. Well, a gentleman, coach and administrator at Mount Sac, which is a suburb of LA. You've heard of the Mount Sac relays.
Of course.
Brian Yokoyama. I was talking with Brian one day, and I said, Brian, I got a curiosity. I said, over the last 10 years, how many U.S. pole vaulters, male, female, can you think of whose career ended prematurely due to injury? And he thought about it, and he goes, well, one. And then he hedged on that, and he said, and of that one, he's actually attempting to come back. Well, I can list 10 high jumpers off the top of my head whose careers ended prematurely due to injury. Now, on face value, wouldn't you think the vaulter running down the runway, putting a 16-foot pole into a box, going up 18, 20 feet in the air and falling wouldn't you think the propensity of injury would be greater in vault than high jump? Yet it's a 10-to-1 ratio that high jumpers were getting hurt and to the point where they couldn't continue their career. Why is that? And that's, again, my curiosity is I need to figure out why. And the nature of poorly executed runs over time has a toll. You pay a tax. It's not one traumatic moment. With rare occasion, we actually have had some trauma, but typically it's not one traumatic moment. It's the accumulation of less than optimal performance over time. And if you trace the kinetic chain, where's the weak link? And over time, as you erode that component, eventually that's where you have your problem. And so
Mm.
we have a history of Achilles problems and knee problems that didn't necessarily need to occur except for the poor execution and the poor instruction of the event.
Mm. It's so funny that you mentioned that because I'm now thinking about where does triple jump sit in all of that. And in reality, I don't have a counter number to what you've said, but I do know that a lot of the athletes um, over the last 10 years that have won European championships in particularly, like Nelson Ivora, Fabrizio Donato, and Jonathan Edwards, to be honest, jumped well in their 30s, 35s, which is interesting because I don't know how normal that is in high jump. You'll obviously tell me, but you would think with the nature of triple jump that that wouldn't be the case, but
Well,
may
let's go back really quickly. I don't want to cut you off, but really
no.
quickly, let's go back to that scenario where the athlete drifts inward for 2 steps,
Hmm.
pivots, penultimate plant. That pivot, that torque twisting action on the what's going to be the plant step occurs 2/10 of a second before the amazing force is at plant. So you're going to twist on that leg, that knee, and then you're going to slam it into the ground at the plant. How many times can you get away with that before something's going to raise its hand and say, I'm not doing this anymore?
Hmm. Hmm.
It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very
you know
interesting.
but if you bring I'm glad you brought up Jonathan Edwards, because a peer of his at the time, Brian Wellman out of Bermuda, is somebody that always sticks out in my mind. How is it that Brian and Jonathan, built more like fire hydrants than long lived athletes, were so successful in their event? And so that now, in the States, we have a television program called 60 Minutes that just ran uh, an interview, and they were looking at gout down in Australia, and they talked with his coach and that sort of thing. And somebody commented on it on social media, and I made a comment in return, and I drew a parallel between gout and Mutaz Barshim. And the point I was trying to make was there's an optimal mass and the need for execution of forces and absorbing and returning force. But at the same time, buddy of mine, another biomechanist, Mike Young, who actually was at LSU for a while,
Hmm.
Mike coined the phrase "fat don't fly." So you don't want to carry an ounce of extra weight that's not performing, that's not assisting you in your performance of your event. So Barsham, and I'll draw the parallel with Sotomayor. Barsham was knocking on the door of Sotomayor's record, wasn't able to take it out. Now, his pound per pound of force ratio was different, but Sotomayor, whatever you believe about his pharmaceutical influences, was a structurally more robust individual. So his ability to apply force and absorb force and redirect force was different. So, we go back into the length of a career and uh, when you do something over and over and over, there's a repetitive use injury. Even if you do things, let me back it up. If you perform your event, whether it's long, triple, high, vault, whatever the case may be, whatever event, you perform it optimally every time, there's still wear and tear. It's not normal to go slam your body around every other day and go in the weight room and move heavy weight. That's not normal for the body. So you're already on a timeline. Your body can only take so much abuse. But when it's, to use a military term, when it's friendly fire, when it's a self-inflicted wound that doesn't need to be, that's the challenge. And that's the thing. That's where I have a problem when I watch coaches. There was a coach years ago, I'm not going to use his name, but there was a coach who basically, to boil it down, had a philosophy where he'd bring in a bunch of athletes and he'd beat them up. And the few that survived were the outliers, that they were going to be successful. They were just, durable and gifted. But that's such a non-holistic, kind of irresponsible approach to instructing and developing talent. But it worked, and those athletes were successful. And I guess it's one way of doing it, but I wouldn't say it's the optimal way or the responsible way of doing it. So, I mean, you can get ethical, philosophical. We can go down a lot of different paths, but if you boil it back or bring it back to optimizing performance and what's the best instructional methods to get there, and what's the best, to again optimize a performance not only just once in 4 years, but on date certain once every 4 years. And how do you narrow the scope and hone the edge of the knife to that moment in time to be at the right place at the right time in optimal position with optimal performance technique in 100% health. That again, these all kind of spill into other areas. The great multi-event coach Harry Mara was known for regularly saying, I would rather have an athlete at 80% technical competency and 100% healthy than 100% mastery and 80% healthy. And so, we could do an hour on that from here forward if we wanted to. So there's all these you have all these competing interests and all these areas that you can have more or less of, and how do you distribute that? And again, I think that's like I said, the appeal to me of track and field relative to other sporting areas of how do you maximize performance. We haven't gotten into psychology or any of the other things, but they all kind of need to come together to create that perfect moment.
Mm. Yeah, it's like and I think you kind of referenced this earlier, but Stu McMillan, who's the CEO of Altus, would often talk about how the component parts are much less important than the system. The system being the sum of those component parts. And oftentimes as coaches, we focus very individually on isolated parts, and that's kind of, I suppose, almost a summary of your discussion and what you talked about with regards to fixing the right problem as well within the technical side of things. Um, David, that's about all time we have for today, but I really do appreciate your time coming on, and I think many people would actually like to take some of your ideas further by doing their own reading and potentially listening to other podcasts that you've done. So is there any references or sorry, resources that you'd point people towards to read up more on what you do? I know you mentioned the eccentric training piece being a little outdated, but I read it myself, thought it was very good, as well as the fixing the right problem. So at this time, yeah, if you want to point people towards any direction, that would be great.
Well, I can tell you in general that I refer to myself as open source, that I take everybody's call. I'm not everybody's cup of tea. I come from the Dan Path School of Mentorship, where Dan made me a better person because he doesn't necessarily just give you the answer. He points you in a direction and makes you read. He'll use terminology that's out of your scope at a given point in time and have to elevate to that next level. So it's I think the comparison is the story about, if you give a man a fish, he eats for the day. If you teach him how to fish, he eats for life.
Hmm.
So, um, so again, I'm like I said, I don't charge people. I'm not looking to make money off of assisting anybody. Um, but at the same time, it's not something where it's just easily given. You have to work a little bit if you want some help. So with that being said, I am available. My email address is dkerin at KerinPerformanceInsights.com. So anybody can reach me that way. Uh, if we, strike up a conversation, we can exchange phone numbers and that sort of thing. Um, I'm happy, the beauty of video is it's easily sent, and I'm happy to look at individuals and identify what I see. Hopefully I can find something or identify something that might be being missed otherwise. And yeah, I'm so grateful to the people in sport, both named in this discussion and too many more that haven't been mentioned, that have enabled me to have a lifetime of enjoyment and satisfaction in the constant search for greater understanding and the gratification of knowing you helped someone. So I think it's beholden to people to then pay it forward. And so, again, please, people feel free to reach out. And if I can help anybody, I'm always available.
That's very generous of you, David. Yeah, no, it's totally evident even from, this podcast and talking about your mentors that, you are certainly doing that. And I'd also just recommend that people follow you on LinkedIn as well if they're LinkedIn users, because I think you post some interesting thoughts up there too.
Well, just really quickly, LinkedIn tends to be a little higher discourse in that area. Selfishly, I mentioned earlier that I have an ulterior motive in LinkedIn, that I am working on a product, a platform, and so I'm poking the bear a little bit, tongue in cheek, and sometimes not so much. But so there is a different discourse, and but again, people should elevate that. The saying is, be the dumbest person in your circle of friends. So if you always talk with the same people, how do you advance? How do you get out of that nepotism sort of repeat cycle? So maybe LinkedIn is a good place for people to look and follow and learn what it's very cutting. It's the current information. It's what's taking place in sport and in technology and that area. But the dialogue tends to be more sports tech than sport performance specifically.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it may or may not be. Check it out, and if it's something that's of interest or you people find it's of value, then by all means jump in the pool.
Yeah, I even find it just interesting to see how you think, really. And that's a perspective that you can gain from, I suppose, reading articles like your own and also those LinkedIn posts that people are looking at things in 3D. I previously wasn't, and so on. You're able to pick up, a lot of information when you're reading through a variety of mediums, I find. So, no, really appreciate it again, David. Thanks so much for coming on.
Absolutely, really enjoyed it. Thank you.